everyone, welcome back to my channel. So in this week's video, I'll be showing you how I made a Xenomorph cake for H.R. Giger's birthday. If you don't know the Xenomorph, it's the alien creature from the famous Alien movie franchise, and it showcased the visual design of H.R. Giger, a famous Swiss artist. So here's the iconic head of the Xenomorph in all of its glistening smoothness, and then his full-blown bod. I'm sure we can all tell what inspired Giger's design. Alien has always been one of my favorite movies of all time, and the whole look of the Xenomorph is just so iconic and beautiful to me. The day I post this video will be February 5th, which would have been Giger's 82nd birthday. I believe he passed back in 2014, correct me if I'm wrong. But I thought, what a more fitting way to commemorate his legacy than to butcher his design and attempt to make a birthday cake in his honor. To say that the task was daunting would be an understatement. He's a detailed little guy, and I'm scaling him down. So I thought the best way to start was just to lay out the Xenomorph's body in simplified segments. Fondant hardens when exposed to air, but I just needed a good idea of proportions before I went in with all the little biomechanical parts. You can see that I've chosen him to be in a fetal position, and he'd be laying on top of the cake. I'm sure I stole this idea off of Pinterest, and it was probably the best version of him that a novice sculptor, if you can even say that, like me, can handle. You'll also see my cat Bean stalking in the background, fearless like Jones, and attempting to snatch bits of sugary fondant because some cats are freaks. The head was a bit of a struggle, to be honest, but like most things, once you get started on something, it's a little less scary as you go on. Another reason why I thought I'd go piece by piece was simply to make transporting him on top of the cake much easier. Also, if I mess up, I can just replace that piece instead of trying to chop off a bunch of pieces from his body. By day 2, I was already completed with most of his body and needed to give the guy basically a foot and his long signature tail. I also have to mention that the hardest bit was probably his hand. His fingers are more like long, skinny talons, and when you're working on something that's already small, trying to attach little bits of fondant at that scale is a challenge, to say the least. As soon as I was able to get the fingers on, I crumpled up like a little bit of paper towel, as you can see, to support his hand as it dried. I also made this hand a separate piece. When attaching fondant, you really only need to add water. It'll create its own sticky type glue, and it usually works best when the fondant itself isn't too dried out. I also have to mention that I say day 2, but at this point, I was only working on the cake for maybe an hour a day. The tail is designed with ridges, sort of like what you'd see on a screw, but just not continuous. And I thought I could get away with sticking little almond-shaped pieces, but I quickly scrapped that. I do like to rush, which is a terrible habit when it comes to things like this, but sometimes shortcuts look cheap and ugly. Now to finally make the cake. I knew I wanted the insides of the cake to look a little alien-ish as well. I had a whole bunch of yummy cake mixes like carrot cake, strawberry cake, and funfetti, but the last thing a Xenomorph would look like on his insides is freaking funfetti. So I opted for a pure white cake mix and thought I could dye it gray with this black gel dye that I had on hand. Then it clicked in my head to make the sponge blueberry flavored because that faint blue look is pretty similar to what I was looking for. I thought I could mix blueberries into a gray cake and it was all like pretty cohesive. Also, I had a carton of blueberries to toss in, so it worked out perfectly. Here I am adding that black dye to give it that great look. I actually added quite a few drops after I went in with some blueberry flavor extract I bought, and thankfully it made the batter even darker and grayer. I believe I added 2 teaspoons of the extract, and that should be enough for 1 box of cake mix. Bought it at Michael's, by the way. For the blueberries, I found a tip online to toss them in some white flour so they wouldn't stick to the bottom or like sink to the bottom. You'll see me only use a little bit of the berries, which I regret now. I should have used the entire bowl that I used. On top of that, I kind of did a sandwich technique with the batter when really I was safe to mix it all together since the berries had that flour coating. Always good to know for next time though. And bonus, the extra flour didn't alter the flavor of the cake. At least I don't believe it did. And here's the cake straight out of the oven. Apologies, by the way, for the horrendously yellow tint, but the lighting isn't the greatest in my kitchen. The cake was a bit domed on top, so I knew I had to level the guy off. Also, at this point, my kitchen smelled like a blueberry dream, and it was torture while I was working out. So it was nice to scarf down that little extra bit of sponge that I shaved off. Next up was the frosting, and I chose to do a simple buttercream yet again. Going forward with decorative cakes, I'll probably always choose this frosting, mostly because it's better to work with in conjunction with fondant. I actually haven't seen people use different types of frosting when making fondant cakes, so I'll just stick with what people usually use. You'll also see me add Nut Pods creamer instead of actual half and half or heavy cream. Our house hardly ever uses heavy cream, so as much of a sin as this is, it ends with a similar consistency and much less wasted dairy. I added the powdered sugar in batches to the butter because powdered sugar is just a messy pain to work with, as you can see on my shirt, and slowly incorporated the rest of the sugar as I built up the buttercream frosting paste, if that makes sense. I chose to dye the frosting green because the Xenomorph's blood is actually this green acidic liquid that can eat through walls, so it only made sense. Like I mentioned before, my food dye isn't the greatest. I did want it to be like a really bright green, but I didn't want to oversaturate my frosting with all this food dye. So the color came out a little bit too pastel and Eastery than I wanted, but continuing on. This is me slicing a sponge in half awkwardly again. As you can see, the blueberries weren't as evenly spread out in the batter. I could have added way more, but it still tasted great. Then went on to ice the cake awkwardly. It wasn't until after I was done that I realized I could have used a ton more frosting to crumb coat this cake. I know why, but I always thought it was supposed to be like a thin layer that goes on top of your cake just to act as adhesive. But turns out you can do a giant thick layer so that your fondant comes out smoother after it's laid on top. I struggle still with frosting a cake and making sure that little bits of crumb don't mix into the frosting. And I think that's also what leads to just a bumpier cake. Next time I'm going to make sure to actually pipe frosting on a very thick layer and then smooth it out so that I have a much cleaner surface to work with. Also, quick note, I handled this fondant terribly, but I was also in a rush to get it away from my cat. With my back turned, he was able to claw and bite at it. So apologies for this super clumsy fondant work, and I thank you for your patience. With my cake covered, I decided to create some details that would go around the walls of the cake. Giger's art is always hyper detailed and crammed with all sorts of biomechanical textures, and I wanted to make sure that the cake was cohesive. So I actually measured the circumference, and although my math was super off, it gave me something to work with. I then rough sketched off some panels that I would then repeat all around the exterior. So that spinal pattern is very Giger, as well as the ridging and the chords. Once I cut out some panels, I went in after with the details. I used this paper stencil out of cardstock to make the repeating spinal cord look so I wouldn't drive myself crazy trying to do this with a sculpting tool. I also rolled the fondant very thin because nothing's gross than cake with an inch thick fondant on the sides. And here are all the panels and cords that I made. I was actually really happy with how these turned out, and now I just need to attach them to the sides of the actual cake. Then the most exciting step of the whole thing, laying the Xenomorph down on top of his little cake bed. I'm so happy that I made it in segments. If not, this part would have been an absolute nightmare. Last step was to go in and highlight the raised bits with this white airbrush paint, and yes, it is edible. And here's the finished product. I have to say I'm pretty pleased how it came out despite the lumpiness. Apologies for the absolutely terrible audio and blurriness you'll be subjected to right now. And here's the cake. It's all done. I actually went over kind of the space on the top, not the alien itself, but like kind of like the background of him. I covered in some of this gel icing frosting, but I'm also going to be kind of drizzling on the cake after I sliced it, but it kind of gave like a saliva-y, shiny look to it, kind of messy, kind of gross, just like how he is when he drools. And I thought it offered some good contrast considering it's an all-black cake. And now we get to actually cut into him. Okay, one thing I'm afraid of is that it's black fondant, so it's gonna stain the crap out of your teeth. Mmm, that blueberry, so good. Really good, really happy. This is probably, I mean, it was my first time using a fruit extract or a flavoring extract, but I also added those fresh blueberries. But it came out really good. Kind of reminds me of one of those Costco muffins, the ones that are as big as your head. So this is awesome. Very happy. So this is the end of the video, and I actually had so much fun making this cake. I would say it's my favorite besides the Necronomicon I had made for the first time. I was pretty nervous going into it just because it's such a distinct art form, and it's definitely not perfect, I'm not saying that, but I did have a lot of fun recreating or trying to recreate something that is like mathematically beautiful, if that makes any sense. I know that sounds really cheesy, but that's just how I feel, and I have to say I'm a lot happier with this guy than I was with the two previous cakes. So it definitely boosted my confidence a bit, and I really can't wait to hop on to my next project. But thank you so much for joining me. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. I truly appreciate it. And also thank you for staying and sticking through the very end, and I will see you guys next time. Bye.